All right, this is the meat and potatoes video of all of the settings that you might want to use for a raised relief. Here we have an example of a relief. Our relief camera shows this is the scene that we're looking at. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is max angle. So max angle determines from the ground plane how much of an angle the takeoff from the surface can be. And so a max angle of closer to 90 would allow the edges of this from the ground plane to basically go straight up. So if we generate that relief, we can see that these edges are allowed to go at a much steeper angle, and the resulting relief can be much deeper. If you're working with wood, you're probably going to be in like the 65 to, something like that, upper band of this. You probably want to avoid extremes. If you're working with coins or very shallow reliefs, things that need to be stamped or laser ablated, you're going to be down roughly in the 20. You're going to be in the lower third of this band, right? So if we set this to 18, for example, and we generate relief, this is going to be much shallower, and the takeoff angle is going to be really subtle, right? Allowing us to get this kind of result. Much more suitable for a coin. Now, the height scale takes the result and attempts to make it more prominent or less prominent. And height scale matters more the more max angle you have. So I can bump this up to 1,000, but I have a really shallow max angle. I'm not giving it a lot to work with. So if I generate this relief, we will see a difference. It's going to be really minor. There you go. However, if I make this 70 for my max angle, right? And then I bump up the height scale. We're giving it a whole lot more room to work with, and that's going to make the result much more prominent, perhaps even too distorted for our liking. So just be aware that height scale matters in terms of the max angle that you've chosen. We're going to leave our max angle at maybe 30, our height scale at the default of 65, and I would recommend your primary dial for all the stuff you're doing is going to be max angle. Play with height scale if you need to, otherwise leave it the default. Next thing we'll talk about is blur. So let's get back to a steady state relief. And blur is pretty simple. If I increase the blur, I'm going to get a blurry relief. So you probably want to avoid extreme values, but if you use smaller values, you can kind of get some interesting effects, kind of like a shrink wrap effect. So stylistically, that might be interesting to you. But otherwise, some models have maybe one missing triangle, and it's causing kind of a black hole effect where that triangle is. The relief maybe dips down. And this can be a way, if you just introduce a little bit of blur, to kind of mitigate some of those problems from time to time. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. So a little bit of blur is usually undetectable, leaves all that detail that can help mitigate some problems with your model. The next thing we'll talk about is contour step size. And so if we go to our relief camera and we change the contour to not 0, we see all these pink lines appear on the canvas. And this is where the contours have been defined. Contour is kind of like a silhouette. So if I hold my hand up, everywhere where my hand meets empty space, right on the edge, is a silhouette. And so these are useful for a few reasons. Let me go ahead and zero this out. And my coin guys out there are going to love this because it's particularly useful for shallow reliefs. So let's look here. Pretend we're making a coin, and we see the head in front of this arm kind of loses the plot, right? We want it to be more prominent where this contour meets the leg. So if we go ahead and raise this up to maybe 0.9, generate a relief, everywhere there was a red line is going to get a little bit of a bump. And so we can see that now that's been raised up a little bit. Depending on your model, you may need very little of this or you may need more. And the contour step angle determines the angle of these sidewalls for the bumps. And so similar to max angle, play with this. the step angle will matter more for larger step sizes. So you may not get a huge difference between, for a 0.91 between the angles. But as you increase this step size, you're going to get a much more prominent effect based on these step angles. So low step angles are going to give a slightly blurrier appearance. High step angles are going to give a much more crisp appearance, generally speaking. All right, now let's talk about post-processors. We're going to zero that out. Let's go ahead and make a 35 angle relief with no blur to get back to a steady state. Easiest way to understand these post-processors is to play with them. So these are the detail bands. Form is the basic shape of something. Mid is kind of the middle level details, like the little bumps that make up these arms or the head. Its general size. And then fine detail band is all the little ridges and little scales, things like that. We can get a really clear picture of what this is affecting by zeroing everything else out and just looking at one at a time. So let's make these go down. And the form is this, right? This shape. And when we increase it, that is the kind of result that we're going to get. Likewise with the midband, if we zero out the form, this is what it's affecting. And for the fine detail, it's just these fine little components of the model. And so when you add these three bands together at 100% or in any combination, you get the result that you're used to. And so why might you want to use these things? Well, the thing you're going to do most often is you're going to just bump the fine detail way up, right? As you make shallower and shallower reliefs, maybe for a coin, you start to lose some of the detail. And so by bumping it up, you can bring a lot of that detail back without creating a lot more height. And so it allows you to make a max angle that's even shallower while maintaining a lot of that really cool detail that makes the model pop. Other uses of this are kind of for special effects purposes. So we could make the mid go all the way down and just leave our form and our fine detail. And we'll see that this gives kind of a beveled result without a ton of depth deviation that would be caused by the midband's undulations. And it just gives us a stylistically interesting, different output. And so you can even lower this a little bit. And by playing with these things, you can get lots of different interesting results that may be suitable for what you're trying to accomplish. By and large, most of you are going to leave form and mid at 100%, and you're just going to bump the fine detail. Bevel is the next thing that we'll talk about. Bevel basically takes the model and it tries to add a little bit of an edge to it. And you can go from tiny to large. Now, depending on what you've done with the form, mid, and fine post-processors, you may not see the result of this thing because it will be overtaken by what you've done up here. Just be aware of that. But Bevel can be useful to make things pop off the screen just a little bit. And then finally, we are at invert. So maybe give a little bit of a bevel. And let's click invert. And now the model has just been made into a recessed relief. And so that would be suitable for something like mold manufacturing or something like that. Those are all the basic settings that you're going to use to generate the lion's share of all your reliefs. And the last thing that we'll talk about is the resolution section. So it's important to know that the post-processors are acting on whatever resolution you're working with. The degree to which these are real time depends very much on the resolution that you've chosen. So if I move this slider, this is kind of real time, but it's doing a whole lot of work on a 2K result. If I go down to 1K, now I get a much more real-time approach. So just be aware, if you're at the stage where you're playing with post-processors and you want to really dial it in, consider lowering your resolution to where it's more real-time and more comfortable to work in. And then when you've nailed it, ramp it back up. Resolution basically defines the X and Y of the output image in pixels. So 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, 2048, 4096. Or you can choose a custom value. Lastly, we'll look at oval design. You don't have to have a square relief. You can have an oval of a circular nature or actually ovular if you change the width and height to different values. Finally, we'll look at tighten crop. So if you have a model that does not take up everything, you can click tighten crop, and that will change the background frustum width and height to match the aspect ratio of your model and also give you a little bit of buffer. As well, if you click exact crop, and this doesn't work super well with ovals, so we'll take that off. Exact crop gives us a view frustum that is exactly aligned with the edge pixels. Be aware that the camera settings matter here. So this definitely works in orthographic. It works a little bit less well in perspective mode. So if I click exact crop here, I'm not getting exactly the result. It's kind of close, but just be aware that there's a difference in terms of the camera type that you're using. So these are all the settings for raised reliefs. And the good news is, since you now know how these work, you also know how recessed and both works because they're exactly the same. Same principles apply, and you can use all the knowledge you just learned for 3/4 of all of the relief types. The final settings we'll talk about are projection, and there's not a ton here because of the way that projection works. So all you have access to here is blur and the height scale and the invert relief. So let's just make a quick relief. Typical projection style relief. We can blur the result. And then in our post processors, this lets us control a very linear scaling of the Z values here. And so you can dial it in if there's a particular kind of look that you want. Likewise, we can invert the reliefs, and that's it. So in this video, we've covered a lot of stuff, but it's all really important because now you know how all of the settings apply to different reliefs, when you might use some settings for coins versus wood, and how to get and dial in the exact relief that you want.